Okay, everyone, I want to open with a really important announcement, kind of an urgent news announcement, if I have everyone's attention. It is currently 13 degrees colder in Ann Arbor, Michigan, than it is in Moscow, Russia. So I just want everyone to be aware of this, and it makes me all the more grateful that so many people have turned out in the cold to come and see our event today. It's actually a big day for WCED. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, WCED. And it's a big day for us because it's kind of a nice chance for us to kind of unfurl a new initiative that we have. And Elena Milashina is our inaugural fellow under this initiative, which we've styled the Freedoms Under Fire Fellowship, which is a residency fellowship that we've just begun here at WCED. And so for those of you online and here, if there are people who in the future you think would be good candidates for this, we would love nominations and ideas for people who would be, so dissidents, journalists, academics, activists who are currently in unsafe conditions due to authoritarianism being on the rise so many places around the world. So inaugurating this fellowship was really kind of motivated by two big events, one of which has been very gradual and one of which was much more sudden. So the first event has been the gradual and growing assault on the rights of journalists in particular, but not just journalists, on activists, on dissidents, on academics, on civil society that we see sort of flooding around the world at this point. This has been happening for over a decade, but this restriction of on public space, on civil rights, on human rights is really becoming a global, quite a global crisis. And the second, much more immediate and sudden crisis was Vladimir Putin's military invasion of Ukraine. And to my mind, that event in particular carried two really vital lessons. The first and most crucial lesson is, and most important imperative, was to defend Ukraine. But the second really vital lesson to me that arose from Putin's invasion of Ukraine is that it's essential to defeat Putin. And that means, first and foremost, defeating Putin in Ukraine, but also defeating Putin where he has the most victims and has had the most power, which is in Russia. So it seems to me that the imperative we face to defeat Putin and to defeat Putinism as it exists around the world is really a vital challenge for our time. And so I think it's incredibly appropriate that our inaugural fellow under our Freedoms Under Fire Fellowship is someone who has been Vladimir Putin's foe for so very long. Elena Milashina, I will introduce her now. She is the, as I said, the inaugural fellow under our Freedoms Under Fire Residency here at WCED. She is a journalist for Novaya Gazeta, Russia's most prominent independent newspaper. She covers human rights violations in Russia's North Caucasus republics and brings attention to accounts of enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial executions, torture, and persecution committed by governmental agents. She also writes about women's and LGBTQ rights in Russia. As an investigative journalist, she has received numerous awards, including the Human Rights Watch's Alison Deforge Award for Extraordinary Activism, the International Woman of Courage Award, and the Prize for Courage by Reporters Without Borders. She was a 2009-2010 Knight Wallace Fellow here at the University of Michigan. The title of Elena's talk today will be The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in Russia. I should note this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Russia, East European, and Eurasian Studies, CREASE, also by the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, WCEE, and by the Wallace House Center for Journalists. And on that note, I want to add a particularly special thanks to Wallace House, especially to its director, Lynette Clementson, who worked really closely with us to make this visit by Elena possible. And so I really hope that this will be just the first of many fruitful collaborations between WCED and Wallace House and the amazing work that you do in the years to come. So without further ado, Elena Milashina, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. It was a great introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to listen to me. Usually, I talk without papers because I like to talk with the audience, although I'm very nervous always. But today, I put it on the paper because a lot of information was new for me also. I'm not an expert in this field. I want to begin with that. And I'm just an active journalist whose career began in 1996. And this year, 1996, I want you to remember it, is considered by experts to be critical and perhaps the most important in the history of development of free media in Russia. And I will explain later why this is mostly likely the case. My personal story as a journalist largely illustrates the situation that has happened to the Russian media. When I started working as a journalist, I had a huge choice of a place of work. From state-owned media to independent media, from TV and radio to press. At that time, freedom of speech and absence of both censorship and self-censorship was practiced in every Russian, almost every Russian media. And I chose for my first work a small, independent, and very little known in Russia and especially in the world newspaper, new newspaper on Novaya Gazeta, which now is well known. And this choice was justified solely by the quality of the text that this newspaper was published. Initially, I wanted to write about cultural things, reviews, trends, books, music, but ended up with investigative reporting and the topic of human rights violations by the state. In a sense, I was very lucky because if I had entered the profession 10 years later, I would have already had a very limited choice of media that would have not been censored. I worked for Novaya Gazeta for 27 years. Last year, the government took away from Novaya Gazeta a media registration certificate, or more simply, a license. Last year, or rather the last 2 years, 21st and 22nd, were absolutely devastating for independent Russian media. But today I will try to tell you that the process of the collapse of freedom of speech began in Russia long ago, even before the election of President Putin. And that this process is directly related to the wars in Russia that has been there for almost the 30 years that Russia actually exists, inside the country and abroad. I apologize for my level of English, as well as for the fact that some information will not be sufficiently clear for you. I encourage you to ask me questions, and I will try to answer them after I finish my speech. For your convenience, and for my convenience too, I divided the speech by the presidents that Russia had for all those 30 years, and I start with Gorbachev. But first of all, I want to say you that you should know that the history of Russia, a long history. And all this history time, we had the censorship beginning from the first newspaper that we had in 1725 that was published when Peter the Great was the Tsar of Russia. And only President Gorbachev, back then he was General Secretary Gorbachev, in I believe 1986, he admitted that the censorship exists in Russia, and he said that it actually was banned in 1990 when the USSR law on press came into force. And the decision to end the censorship was very difficult for Mikhail Gorbachev. Then the media was called not the media, actually, or mass media. The media officially were called mass media and propaganda. And the main thing that you have to get to understand from my speech, and I tell it from the beginning, that after all, the main thing that freedom of speech was given us by Mikhail Gorbachev, that means from above. That was not a requirement of society or journalists, and it's very important to understand. At that time, why Gorbachev actually did it? Because at that time, the media were a tool for reform and change in the country. And many experts and researchers call Gorbachev's last couple years just the best period for Russian media, because then 1992 began and the collapse of Soviet economy came, including the media economy with its 3 million circulations and salaries and state subsidies and etc. But this couple of years, when the Communist Party was living out in its last days and control from above was weakened, and Russian society stopped being scared, was open, and even demanded changes, are called the golden age of free Russian media. It was at that time that the press law was adopted, like I said, in 1990, which abolished censorship. But the other thing that this law made, it allows usual people, like journalists, every journalist could be a founder of newspaper now. Any person can be a founder of newspaper, and you don't need to ask Communist Party or somebody else for permission. And that led to variety of newspapers, journals, and different kind of media, radio stations that appeared at that time. But no matter this law was very progressive for its time, some leftovers from the communist system still wasn't taken away and still exists till now. And I want to tell about them a little bit more specific. First, the dividing the media in Russia on state media and on non-state media. For example, my newspaper is non-state media, which is, this dividing is very absurd. None of European countries, or I think Western countries, has this dividing. And from the beginning, you can tell that state media is just a small part of the whole media picture in Russia. Yes, but the majority population that cover this media is it's majority of population. It's enormous number of population that receives the news from the state media. And the second, the state media is always ahead of the non-state media because they have a lot of money from commercial and they have a lot of money from the budget. And they have access to information, to politicians, officials. So they always ahead of non-state media, and non-state media actually came to its role that they are second-hand media. Well, not second-hand media, but the media on the second roles. There is no equality. The other thing is that we didn't achieve a real public broadcasting media in Russia, which is typical for all Europe. Only 3 countries in Europe do not have public broadcasting. It's Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. It's very important, and there is a big difference between state and public broadcasting, and I don't need probably to explain you this difference, but shortly saying, it's just, it's controlled by the society, not by the state. The other thing is that we still have, like back in Soviet Union, a licensing body which is not independent from state and from the main TV and radio business, and this is important because that could have impact on quality of content that Russian TV actually was putting on a broadcast. And the other thing that hit us last year, it's the state registration. We still have to apply for the certificate from the state, and for many years, like 30 years almost, it was like notifying, not permissive, and it was like easy registration thing to do. But last year, the state used it from us and actually took away the license because we still have to register. When you register the media in Russia, you have to tell the state that you are doing it. And now, no matter that, like I said, it's notifying, they just took away our license and won't permit us to open a new media. And the last but not the least, we still have criminal prosecution of journalists for slander and insult, but we never actually achieved the stage when the prosecution, the crimes against journalists and have been investigated and acquitted with the crimes against the state. That's why almost none of the journalists murder were investigating, beginning from the murder of Vlad Listyev in 1994, which was the most popular Russian journalist of Yeltsin era. And so coming to Yeltsin. During the Yeltsin era, the media had tremendous freedom. In a sense, this freedom can be called anarchy. In the way that Yeltsin was criticized, none of the leaders of our country have ever been criticized. Maybe Mikhail Gorbachev is close to Yeltsin in this way, because still a large number of Russian citizens blame Gorbachev for the collapse of the Soviet Union, although it was in fact Boris Yeltsin and presidents of Belarus and Ukraine back in December 8, 1991, destroyed the Soviet Union by signing the Belovezhskaya Agreement papers. However, this was the period when the Russian media had the most freedom. But it was during this period when the authorities began to revive the tools of control over the media and put direct pressure on the media. And, which is more sad for me even, the journalists themselves began to give up their freedom. But in the 90s, like I said, the influence of journalism on political process was gigantic. It had a direct impact on political decisions. And the most probably important event in this sense was the first Chechen war that we had. To explain the context on Chechen war, it happened in 1994 between Russia and small region of Russia named Chechnya, where the rebellions called for independence, and actually they had 3 years of not formally but informal independence. And in 1994, this conflict came to military stage. In terms of coverage of this war, it was called a television war or TV war. The action of authorities were criticized by the vast majority of Russian, including state TV. Actually, the state TV was the biggest critics of the authorities, and its chief, Oleg Poptsov, Yeltsin wanted to fire him even, and for state TV. In many ways, the state itself, and primarily the army, was to blame for this, which was unable to provide journalists with access to information and reported false information about the situation in the front, hiding the data on number of dead soldiers and losses among civilians in Chechnya. In addition, the attitude towards journalists on the part of the Russian military was almost the same as towards the Chechen rebels. Journalists were deliberately shot, detained, beaten. The equipment and records were taken away, destroyed. Reports of attacks and aggression by the Russian military on journalists, both Russian and Western, were received and recorded almost every day. A large number of journalists were killed or injured precisely as a result of the actions of Russian military personnel. And if we compare the news report from Chechen war and today's military campaign in Ukraine, we will see that there is nothing new in the methods used by Russian army to fight. During the Chechen war, they were exactly the same as those that shock us today in Ukraine. It's just that Chechen war was 30 years ago and we forgot about it. But nothing really changed in the Russian army in this regard. The difference was only two things, but those things are extremely important. The first is absolute, sometimes even excessive freedom of speech when the emotional context of information, for example, a lot of media during Chechen war excessively on purpose showed the bodies of dead people, Russian soldiers or people in Chechnya, and this was very emotional impact, manipulative impact on the audience. And the second is that the Russian state was at the time very poor and could not pay for the death and injury of Russian soldiers. That is in fact by their lives. This trend will appear only with the coming to power of President Putin, when the state will be ready to generously pay for the death of Russian soldiers. As a result, already by 1996, the end of Yeltsin's first president term, he and Russian government became extremely unpopular and were forced to come to a peace agreement with Chechens, even though Chechen separatists were rapidly turning from rebels fighting for their freedom with the imperial aggressor into radical religious fanatics who actively used the methods of mass terror. Following the result of the First Chechen War, the head of Russian government, Viktor Chernomyrdin, admitted that the state completely lost the informational war. But this was not the admission of mistakes in the official coverage of the war, or most importantly, in the methods of waging the war by Russian army, but the realization that a tighter control was needed both over the media and over society when the country is having war. And actually, it was then, in late 90s, when the state would recreate in the former Fifth Department of KGB, which is in Soviet times was responsible for following and combating dissent. Now the service within the Federal Secretary Service Security Service will be called the Department for the Protection of the Constitutional System and the Fight Against Terrorism. But actually, the main task of this department is the same like the Fifth Department of KGB: follow and search and make repressions against and suppress dissents. This trend, which is most important to understand, appears under Yeltsin's times, not Putin's. And Putin was like a continuation of this tendency only. Another thing that actually played important role and explained why the state during Yeltsin's time didn't put pressure on media in the 90s. It was directly related to the difficult economical situation in Russia and its dependence on the Western, including financial support. The state observance of freedom of speech was one of the most important conditions for receiving of West assistance. But if the state didn't have money, then the oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, did, and they quickly realized how to use the media in the war for huge Soviet assets which were being privatized at that moment in Russia. It's also played a huge role on shaping the Russian media. It must be said that a big number of very well-known journalists were ready to sell themselves to the oligarchs and became, in fact, their servants and took part in informational wars in their commercial interests. My colleague who studied at the same university as me, only 1 year older, remembered this time in such a way. She said, "I remember very well how the deputy editor-in-chief of one very well-known newspaper came to the Faculty of Journalism in the late 90s and gave a master class. And he told us, you have to choose the position of which of the oligarchs you like best and go work there. I still remember I was shocked. Why? This is wrong. Shouldn't the press try to jump out of this interest of particular oligarch? Isn't it the task of the press to describe what is really happening and not from the position of that oligarch?" And this person came wise with experience working as a journalist, and we, the students, looked at everyone from the bottom up, and now they tell us from above that you should follow this. This is a very common, very vulgar understanding of the role of press, which is very common in Russia till now. And a lot of, sorry to say, journalists, main editors, followed this trend. And the society and the usual people, normal people, they were just watching all this. And this is also very important because, like I say, I will come to this, I'm sorry, to this conclusion. The biggest example of this cynical attitude towards freedom of speech and the mission of free speech was the president campaign of 1996, when President Yeltsin, already very sick and extremely unpopular in society, was elected for a second presidential term. I'm sorry, it's the water. And the situation was like this. The main oligarchs of the country stopped the war for assets for a while and get to agreement to assist in those re-elections of Yeltsin because they were extremely afraid of returning the communists to power. And this presidential campaign was one of the dirtiest in the history of Russia, with the very active participants of Western, primarily American political technologists. Western countries also helped the Yeltsin government by issuing loans. Journalists who had, instead of covering the election campaign, who were engaged in propaganda, received a lot of money and preferences from the government for this. But for freedom of speech in Russia, this was a key moment. My editor-in-chief, Nobel Prize winner in 2021, Dmitry Muratov, described the situation as follows. Journalists put their conscience in the safe for a while, but then they lost the key to the safe forever. In fact, of course, the point is not only and not so much in journalistic conscience and in the fact that journalists of the 90s turned out to be they suited to their time, the formation of capitalism in Russia. But the fact that in those days, in 1996, people in power understood two things. First, free media can be dangerous for the government, which make mistakes, for example, plunges its country into war. And second, to maintain power, the media can and should be controlled. Vladimir Putin came to power as Yeltsin's successor, not as an independent politician. Before his appointment as a prime minister, no one, except for probably the residents of St. Petersburg, really knew him. 6 months later, he will win the elections in Russia and will do it with the help of the very media and oligarchs who literally made the dying Yeltsin in 1996. Immediately after the first round of elections in 1996, Yeltsin had a third heart attack, which was hidden from the society by the president, Putin by the president of Russia. Vladimir Putin came to power at the same time as the beginning of the Second Chechen campaign, and the Russian authorities this time were prepared for its coverage in a completely different way than for the First Chechen War. Journalists no longer had such freedom in their coverage. The positions of owners of the media, the same oligarchs, and that means the editors of this media, were completely pro-state. No one called Chechen separatist fighters anymore. They were called terrorists. And the Second Chechen War itself began with some of the worst terrorist attacks in history of Russia, bombing of the houses in Moscow, in Buynaksk, and Volgodonsk. And actually, those attacks have never been yet properly investigated and have left a lot of questions about the involvement of Russian intelligence officers into them. But if on the war in Chechnya, the consensus between authorities and the owners of the media and majority of journalism was reached, that now we're having a right war there, the Russian media still continue to criticize Putin on different stories that didn't have relations to Chechen war. And the most probably one of the most bright of the stories, the tragedy of submarine Kursk that sank in August 2020. 2000, I'm sorry. Yeah. Putin was very much criticized for his behavior during this tragedy. The fleet was criticized for complete lying, for mess that led to the tragedy, and so on. And the critics was held by the main TV channels of the country. The first channel, the state channel, NTV, and so on. And I believe that this tragedy played a huge role in the repressions that followed a year later against the main owners of the media, against the oligarch Vladimir Gusinsky, who was imprisoned and released only when he abandoned his media holding, the core of which was the NTV channel, and against the oligarch Berezovsky, who was the owner of the first channel. He was forced to leave the country and then sell his shares at the discount price. At the same time, the state channel VGTRK was completely reoriented to loyal coverage of the authorities, and since then it's completely loyal, no critics at all. And this is the exactly channel where now the main journalists of this channel threaten the world with the nuclear weapon that Russia can use and blow the world up. This was the way how in his early first term Putin took control of the main TV channels, which were and still are the main source of news for the Russian population. At the same time, the population itself, and this is also the key thing, was indifferently silent when the Putin was attacking the very popular, actually, TV and other media outlets. And first of all, because journalists all these years, when they had freedom, didn't take into account and certainly were not guided by the interest of the society. Journalists played politics, served the interest of rich people. They themselves became both politicians and rich people. At the same time, they were not very interested in how and with what Russia lives. The attitude of journalists to society was approximately the same as that the elite to plebs, as that one of rich to the poor, like winners to losers. And the society reacted the same way. However, during the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency in Russia, the independent press and the internet still remained undeveloped. Although the audience coverage at that time was quite small compared to 140 million in Russia, the attack on media was very gradual. Why? It was chosen, and for a relatively long time, 20 years, there was such an approach of cutting off the cat's tail in parts, instead of, like, for example, in Belarus, to close everything in one fell swoop. The fact is that I think a softer system of control over the media in Russia than in Belarus ensured that in the previous 2 decades a greater penetration of pro-state media and their agendas in the public sphere and created a gray zone that was not protected from opposition content, but at the same time allowed the Kremlin to get its message across to a wider and more independent-minded public. Deal with the remaining media, first of all, with those who were investigated the corruption, the highest echelons of power, and by the time they were very small media outlets with a small audience, and many colleagues didn't really understand why it was necessary to put pressure on them. The Russian authorities began simultaneously with the arrest of opposition politician Alexei Navalny in January 2021, when he actually returned to Russia after being poisoned. What goals the Russian authorities were pursuing became clear in February 2022. I think they were getting ready for the invasion in Ukraine and were cleansing the informational feed before the start of military operation in Ukraine. The war. February 21st was a turning point in this policy, and Putin's policy on free media became the same as Lukashenko's in Belarus. I believe that this way was also facilitated in the fact that the military operation in Ukraine didn't go according to the planned scenario. I believe it is not by chance. It's not by chance that it was called the special war operation and forbade the use of word of war, in addition to the fact that historically the Russian authorities have never called a war. In Chechnya, it was the restoration of constitutional order and the fight against international terrorism. In Georgia, in 2008, it was operation to enforce peace. The Russian authorities apparently really planned in Ukraine a special operation and were not prepared for the resistance of the Ukrainian army and the population and a possibly long-term military conflict that we're having now. And the continuation of this conflict requires the mobilization of the entire Russian society and economy, but it's very difficult now to mobilize society for a special military operation. For this, it must at least be recognized as a war. This play on words played a cruel joke on Russian government itself, which does initially try to block any expression of dissent, both on the part of journalists and for society in terms of the availability of content that contradicts the official position. Immediately after the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, Russia introduced an undated 5 articles of administrative and criminal codes for speaking fakes, that is false information about the armed forces and the situation in Ukraine, discrediting the army and call for sanctions. As part of this legislation, journalists were banned from writing anything about military operation other than official defense ministry press releases. In the first months after the outbreak of hostilities in Russia, the last remaining independent media were closed. My newspaper, TV Rain Дождь, Media Zona, Echo Moscow. Foreign media were also deprived of accreditation and blocked, among them the New York New Times, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and others. Hundreds of journalists left Russia, settling in Georgia, Latvia, Germany, Poland, and Czech Republic, and other countries. A blow similar and strange was dealt to the main news aggregator and, in general, the main analog of Google in Russia, Yandex, with the audience of almost 30 million people, users. From the very beginning, the Yandex news aggregator was forced to put only official reports in the top news and then sold the news and blog platforms to the social network Vkontakte, which is run by the son of the first deputy head of presidential administration, Sergei Kiriyenko. From March to December 2022, 19,535 people were detained for expressing an anti-war position. More than 5,000 people received administrative punishment for discrediting the army. 420 were prosecuted. Approximately 160 Russians are being prosecuted for so-called military fakes. Roskomnadzor, the Russian Federal Service for Supervision of Communication, Information Technology, and Mass Communication, has blocked more than 125,000 materials about military operation in Ukraine. Over the past year, a huge number of journalists left Russia, more than 500 people in March, April 2022 alone. Every day, one foreign agent appears in Russia, and the foreign agent is actually just the euphemism of Stalin's enemy of people. In just 11 months, 220 individuals and organizations were recognized as foreign agents, most of them are journalists and human rights activists. Journalists have been squeezed out of the country, and all of them who openly talk now about what's happening in Ukraine are now criminals under Russian law, regardless of whether a criminal case has been initiated against them or yet not. Despite this outcome, the state continues its repressive actions to criminalize cooperation with the media squeezed out of Russia, criminalizes the consumption and discussion of alternative military information agenda from the state. It's difficult to search, for example, and share this information and discuss it. Under these conditions, social networks have become the main platform for covering military operation and their consequences. The state has recognized foreign social networks, Facebook and Instagram, as extremist. Potentially, the users may face persecution, but so far no such case has been recorded. And the main platform for obtaining information about hostilities in Ukraine was Telegram, became Telegram, created by the famous Russian IT specialist Pavel Durov in the West. It shows that that the authorities still not able, taking all those measures, still not able to achieve unison in covering the situation. And the role now of critics of the Russian army and the authorities have been assumed by so-called patriots, bloggers who actively support military operation in Ukraine, but very dissatisfied with the way the campaign is going. Their criticism and their actual writing in telegrams help Western experts as well as Russian journalists in exile to understand what is really happening in Russian army at the front. The Russian authorities are also trying to control those newfound critics, but so far in much less draconian ways than us. What problems do media outlets face outside of Russia, but broadcasting primarily to the Russian audience? First of all, of course, this is isolation from the sources. Um, there is no longer for those journalists, there is no any opportunity to receive information themselves personally working in the field, and this is a very bad situation for the journalist. Cooperation with these editorial officers is criminalized, and that's why dangerous, and it's been reducing. Their news becomes secondary and more likely comments and ratings, but not the news like they used to be. Work in Ukraine for Russian journalists is also limited. Now they need visas for this and are treated accordingly by the Ukrainian society as a representative of aggressor country in the first place. I should say that such an attitude towards Russian journalists never exist, for example, in Chechnya or even in Georgia. Well, however, the conflict in Georgia took only 5 days, maybe because of that. So Russian journalists in this way can only count on communication with the narrow circle of Ukrainian speakers. And they have limited access to Ukrainian society. In this sense, the ability to influence the situation at once the Russian media, as for example, Russian media was influenced in the Chechen wars or even during the Georgian 5-day conflict, is reduced almost to zero. And it is no less important that their influence on the Russian audience in this regard is also very significantly limited. And another consequence is very also sad that in Russia itself, there is now a sharp shortage of high-quality journalism, including for the covering domestic Russian events that have nothing to do with the war operation. Regarding one of the tragedies that happened in Russia, and last year was rich in tragic events that claimed the lives of citizens, my colleague said that earlier it would have been possible to find a place in a hotel due to the influx of colleagues, but now it's impossible to find a journalist at the site of the tragedy in Russia. In this regard, the access of Russian citizens to the media has collapsed catastrophically. We can say that Russian society is left without a voice. We do not know how the people live, what problems they face, and how they are solved. We don't know what they really think. All we see is the propaganda shows us. Thank you for a long, long speech. I was trying to be short, and now I am ready for your questions.
Hi, Elena. Anthony with the Knight Wallace Fellowship. I was wondering if you could speak a little. We kind of heard from you the sort of the broad overview and the sort of the big picture, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, and sort of how you and your colleagues were able for so long to to try to report on the truth and to try to communicate to the Russian public the real sort of the state of affairs. How was the newspaper able to do that and operate under such tight restrictions for so long? How were you thinking about safety, security? How to the sort of the questions that many news outlets grapple with in sort of repressive countries. How did you, if you can take us a little bit behind the scenes to your newsroom, what kind of conversations were you having sort of internally about supporting colleagues under pressure? What kind of repressions were you facing and your colleagues? If you could kind of take us a little bit behind the scenes and tell us a little bit more about you and sort of take that big picture and sort of tell us a bit more about your work.
Andrea, I think it will make another 45 minutes of me talking. But shortly saying is that, well, first of all, I understood your question, how we dealing after the war started in Ukraine. And my actual question, we don't deal in Russia with this subject at all. We can't because the law like this. And huge part of Russia, or our team of Nova Gazeta team, also flew abroad and now stayed in Litva and making new Gazeta Europe. But in general, how we survived all those years, like I said, the explanation might be why the Putin's regime was cutting this cat's tail in parts all those 20 years, and we were actually the last ones. Because, well, first of all, they wanted to use us to share and spare their agenda and to communicate with the society that is opposite to them. The second is we was not influential in their mind. Our audience was not that big like TV First or NTV or ВГТРК, well, TV. And they were just making it step by step because there is a work on the consequences of the very harsh censorship that was used in Belarus. And this harsh censorship actually brought the society to different camps. And actually, it increased the audience of those media that were censored. So maybe the Putin and his surrounding were just smart enough to do it step by step for a while and let us survive. But in terms our work, for example, I never experienced censorship in my life. Nobody called me and say, my editor-in-chief never asked me to take away anything. Nobody called me from the Kremlin, for example, to take away something from my story or not publish my story. But I have 6 colleagues killed for their job. And this is, in some way, much more serious than direct censorship. So their murders were never investigated, although everybody in Russia knows who actually behind the murder of Anna Politkovska or my friend Natasha Istimirova. And I received threats, and a lot of them, and every time I went to the investigative committee of Russia and write the claim, please open the criminal case against the head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, who said yesterday on public TV that he is gonna kill me. And say, oh, well, he was just emotional, don't worry, continue your work. So that was kind of the environment we were working. But like I said, the cat's tail ended in 2022. And now a new page for Russian media starts. And I don't know if we survive through this war, we will have enough sources to keep ourselves for a future, because future will be one day without this regime. But what will happen next, and if I truly, actually, I believe, it's not a question for me, I believe that the Russian free journalism will survive, because we have so many. I mean, I can spend another 45 minutes to tell you how the Russian journalism improved in terms of ethics, understanding their mission, what kind of new journalists we now having, and those journalists that are probably 10, 15 years younger than me will never sell their freedom to oligarchs for money, for departments, for anything, and to go and do propaganda. They would never do this. So I see these things that probably now not very noticeable, because the tragedy is happening every day and this war is continuing and the people dying. But I truly believe that Russian journalism will survive. Now we have to just do everything we can to to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves not betray the profession. And I don't know, it's very hard. It's very easy to say, but it's very hard to do. But this is our main task right now, because we can do few things to inform Russian people about what's going on in Ukraine, but we still should find the ways to do this. And I think we will. We just need time. I don't know if my answer will be like what you expected.
Should I go? Hi, Elena. Thank you for your insightful words. I was just wondering, how did you go about summoning the courage to continue doing your job with the resilience that you did in the face of death threats against yourself and seeing your colleagues killed?
I don't like this question. I always answer differently because I don't know the answer. But you know what? I mean, journalist. Are you a journalist? I think if you were on my place and somebody asked you this question, you would answer the same. I mean, journalists are crazy people, you know. Yeah, that's the job. It comes with this. And the other thing is, which I always say when I'm answering this question, when the state's not protecting journalism and freedom of speech and never investigate the murders of journalists or attacks on journalists, the only possible way to protect our job, profession, mission, is to always step up and continue the story of journalists who've been murdered doing this story. And that's what I did with Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha. And besides Natasha Estemirova, who was killed, she was a Chechen human rights defender. She worked with Memorial, and she worked with Anna Politkovskaya for many years, and she was my dear friend. And she was killed after I left her apartment next day. She was kidnapped and killed, shot dead. But I just was very angry with this. And I continue. It was kind of a revenge, yeah.
My name is Oksana Chabanyuk. I'm a Weiser Scholar at Risk Fellow at WCED from Kharkiv, Ukraine. I have two questions. First, I'm curious why people are silent in Russia. Why do they not why don't they protest to receive the freedom of speech? And the second question, that you mentioned that Russian journalists are restricted to come to Ukraine because they have to apply for visas. Can you speak more about this? Is it the reason that can be as a restriction? It's just the application for visa. Thank you.
What about visa? I just don't get the question. It's just what you were asking about.
You told that Russian journalists are restricted to come to Ukraine to report.
No, I didn't say that
Because
they're
they have to
restricted.
apply for visas.
I said that the work in Ukraine is now it's not free for them. For example, my colleague Elena Milashina was free to come to Ukraine in the beginning of the conflict, and now she didn't get the visa to come back. And she wrote, I think, very powerful stories on when she was in Kherson and Nikolaev, when they were under attack from the beginning of the conflict. And those powerful stories that what can be put impact on Russian audience. And now she is not able to. That's what I meant. And the first question, it's like another 45 minutes to explain why Russian people are not protesting. Like I said, almost 20,000 people were detained because they were protesting. But compared to 140 million people, it's probably not enough. But the protests in Russia we never had the protests in Russia, actually. All protests that we have and that you are applying it, it's the protest that we had in 2011, 2012. It's still not enough compared to Russian population. And those people who were protesting, they left. 4 million people almost left in the first months after the began from Russia, crossed the border. If those 4 million, like I said once in Munich when I was taking part in the meeting together with Ukrainians, when I said 4 million people, if they turned back from the border and came to Moscow, probably this war would stop. But those people chose that just the other thing. Probably they don't believe that they can change anything. They're afraid of coming on the streets. They have children, I don't know what, but they just went away from Russia instead of staying there and protesting. And the rest of the majority of Russians, it's this Russia that I was trying to explain to you why this Russia actually doesn't need freedom of speech, doesn't believe in this, and doesn't protect it, and doesn't demand it. Because the Russian journalists, many years, were closing their eyes on this part of Russia. They consider those Russians losers, people who are poor and doesn't need any freedoms. That's the answer we getting back from this attitude towards people.
Hi, can I? Yes, my name is Katerina. I'm also a Advisors Center Fellow, Scholar at Risk. So, Elena, my question is kind of follow-up after Alexana's question. You mentioned social networks, social media as kind of alternative to Russian propagandistic media. So do you feel that social media can be influential in this case, talking about war in Ukraine, informing people about war in Ukraine? Because as we see, journalists now, they transfer to like YouTube channels, to other social media to have their own channels. Do you see that happening in Russia, or do you think that could be alternative way to inform Russian public and bring some light into this darkness?
Well, yeah. Right now, this is the only alternative. Sorry, we have for the journalists who actually pushed abroad. But some like Dost or Novaya Gazeta or Meduza, or they're keeping not just their own channels, but the whole newsrooms, yes, and actually try to operate abroad the same way they would operate being in Russia, which is not possible, like I said, because being away, it means being away from the sources, from the land, from the feeling and ability to feel it, to taste it, to smell it. But, being in the field, it just nothing can be compared to this. And it's very important for the journalist. But still, they're trying to operate in this way. So that's the only way. But we need some time to see if the audience is growing or not. And right now, I'm not sure that it's growing. I think they're losing audience because, like I said, they can't take the news from the field. Like they can't work like we used to work during the Chechen War, when we were on both sides, when we saw it our own eyes, when we talked to Chechen people who were under the bombs, or Russian soldiers who were, like first time I went to Chechnya, it was 1999, when I was making a radio story about Chechnya, and the woman called and said my child was killed, and sent me to he was a soldier, he was killed, and I was told that he was killed by Chechens, but it happened in reality that his friends, the soldiers, killed him, and trying to blame to Chechens. And I'm coming back to Chechnya to look in the eyes of his killer. And it's like, okay, I'm coming with you because you can't go alone. And we went there. It's not possible to do this right now. It's not possible to tell the stories right now, and it's very important to tell stories about this. It's very important to tell stories about usual people. For example, I have few news about usual Ukrainian people, how they suffer, because I remember how the Chechen people suffer from those war. And the stories were devastating. They was just tearing apart the heart. And we don't have this kind of stories that can put impact on usual, normal Russian mothers, women, men, because the person compare it to itself when it hits him, that details of the same person as he is and how he suffer, it hits him more than any numbers or any official news, not official news. And that's what is missing in this reporting of Russian journalists. And this is still, it's very important for Russian journalists continue this work, and it's they are brave people actually. Maybe they don't risk their lives in the field, but they all consider now, from the point of Russian law, the criminals. They're doing crimes, but still only they can influence the Russian audience, nobody else. Because I'm pretty sure that someday we will have so many people died at this war that the situation would be changing. When I was preparing this lecture, I was reading about Vietnam actually, and there is a legend that the American media changed the attitude of the people in this country to this war, but that they were not that there was a legend that they're showing how many, what kind of crimes, or I don't know, shootings or using napalm in Vietnam of American forces in Vietnam. These pictures was changing the mind of American people, and it's not true. The thing that changed the American attitude towards the war, the stories about the American soldiers that died in Vietnam were brought here, were buried here, and the stories about their families that lost the loved ones, those soldiers. What this changed the attitude, and it was very slow. I'm sorry to say, probably it can happen in Russia too, because a lot of people dying every day, a lot. And it's a tragedy.
Hi, Elena. Thank you. And I want to just build on Oksana and Katerina's question. You said in your comments that when you think about journalists, it's the younger journalists, maybe 15, 20 years younger than you, that you have faith in them restoring some ethics or values to journalism and bringing it back. When you think about these questions that have been asked about the Russian public, do you think that there's a generational difference and that younger Russians will be the ones? I mean, this happened with Vietnam too, that sort of the younger part of the population sort of pushed the protest, and I don't know what.
70% those who support the war are my mother's generation, Soviet generation. 70% of those who against the war, the generation of my younger colleagues. The new generation, the Russian youth is against this war. That's for sure. And this, of course, is like flashback of Soviet Union. And probably from historical point of view, that something like this should happen because the Soviet Union couldn't collapse without blood. It's too big and too bloody empire. But thanks to Gorbachev and Yeltsin and I don't know what else, but we came, I know, many other people probably. I don't know why it happened, but Soviet Union was collapsing pretty peaceful way. But now we having a war, a real and a war for a long time, and with a lot of people who already died and who will die. And this is a scary thing.
Elena, this is obviously very emotional, personal material for you to be talking about for so much time here. It takes another kind of courage to come up and talk about all of these things before an unfamiliar audience. I want to give you a little bit of a break from thinking about Russia for a moment, to give you hopefully help you restore yourself a bit, with a couple of questions from the audience on Zoom, which are about the United States.
Okay.
Which might be a little bit easier for you emotionally, but maybe harder for many of us in the room to think about at the moment. So the two questions that kind of go well together about the United States. So one, Jimmy Moffat asks, what are some lessons American journalists can learn from the decline of free Russian media? And John Kapuska asks, says, you bring a unique perspective on the subject of journalism and free speech. What are your impressions of mass media, journalism, and free speech in the polarized United States?
Yeah, I would actually, before Trump, I would say that, well, actually, when I was a fellow Knight Wallace Fellowship in 2009, 2010, I was very lucky to hear Mr. Obama, President Obama, talking to the graduates in Michigan Stadium. And he was the first in my life who mentioned this situation when the internet plays its dark role in dividing people to different camps, and those camps never can come together because that's how the mass media, not mass media, but social network works. When people choose the information they only like and it's comforting them, and don't and think that the other information is fake or something else. So first of all, let me say that still American journalism like New York Times, Washington Post, a bit less Wall Street Journal. I read the story about Kadyrov and it was not good, in my opinion. But still, those media outlets, it's the thing that we have only dream about in Russia, because that's not media outlets, that's institutions. Institutions hard and strong enough that even Trump wasn't be able to take away and destroy. But like I said, this new era social network journalism plays both good and bad role with making people enemies. And I don't think that anybody has a recipe how to deal with this, trend that divides people on different camps. You have problems, and those problems probably very serious because well, it's against the democracy and the values, fundamental values. But you have strong institutions to deal with this. We don't have. Our institutions weren't just lasted for 2 Gorbachev's years, called the Russian media, and that's all. I was surprised to get to know this. I truly believe that the golden age was Yeltsin's times. No, it's not. Even shorter. So we have to build those institutions. You already have them, so you have to. You have a chance to protect what you have, but without professional media, without putting all this together, the democracy won't stand.
Well, I mean, it seems like these are very different problems, right? So the kind of the problems of polarization and misinformation that just got raised, but they're really different from the problems of censorship, which, a big theme for your talk. And if we can go back to Russia for a moment, I was just really struck. I really appreciated the historical perspective you brought to the talk. And it's just really has always seemed to me that the Putin regime was really, really born and defined at Grozny. and we're just seeing it show its true colors and true stripes again in Ukraine, as it has in so much of the former Soviet periphery.